The city, once a beacon of light and life, now lay dormant beneath the weight of an unspeakable silence. Midnight stretched its fingers across the skyline, turning metal and glass into shadowed monuments of a civilization teetering on the edge of oblivion. The wind carried the distant hum of machinery, the only evidence that something still pulsed beneath the concrete and steel. Leah stood at the precipice of a crumbling rooftop, her silhouette a sharp contrast against the pale glow of the moon. The wind, icy and relentless, tugged at the edges of her coat, but she remained still, eyes fixed on the streets below. Blocks of darkened windows stared back at her like hollow eyes, their once bustling interiors now abandoned to fear. A city held captive, not by chains, but by something far worse. Uncertainty. Tonight was critical. The assassinations had shattered the planet's fragile order, one leader at a time. Their deaths met not with uproar but with an eerie, collective silence. First, the President of the United Nations. Then, the Chancellor of the Eastern Bloc. One by one, the pillars of human governance had crumbled under invisible hands. There was no warning, no negotiation, just execution. And yet, the true terror had come afterward, when the assassins themselves began to vanish. She adjusted the small earpiece in her ear. A sharp crackle, then Kieran's voice, low and controlled. Target acquired. Leah exhaled slowly. Kieran was always composed, his voice steady no matter how dire the situation. A former intelligence officer, now a ghost in the system, he had perfected the art of detachment. He was methodical, precise. But even he hadn't predicted the speed of the retaliation. No one had. Location, she murmured, eyes still scanning the skyline. Sector 14, moving east. High-speed transport. They're not alone. They never were. The assassins sent to dismantle Earth's leadership weren't mercenaries or common killers. They were the best operatives the galaxy had to offer, trained by empires that spanned the stars, honed to erase obstacles with the efficiency of a scalpel. And yet, someone or something had begun hunting them in return. Leah had expected disorder, even war. But this was something else. Her fingers tightened around the hilt of her weapon, its smooth grip grounding her. Earth had always been underestimated. A backwater planet, they had called it. Too primitive, too fractured to pose a real threat. But what they had failed to understand was that Earth's strength had never been in its weapons. It had been in its shadows. In the unseen. She descended the stairs two at a time, the building groaning under its own decay. The lower levels flickered with remnants of dying streetlights, their inconsistent glow casting distorted shadows against the graffiti-laden walls. The city had once been a masterpiece of human engineering. Now, it was a carcass. A shell waiting to be claimed by the next force powerful enough to seize it. She slipped into an alleyway, the familiar sense of rain-soaked concrete and machine oil mingling in the damp air. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was watching, waiting. Every darkened doorway, every unmoving vehicle, a potential threat. "Back up," she whispered, crouching behind a rusted car as the low hum of an approaching craft filled the night. Kieran's reply was terse. "None. Just us. Of course. Always just them." She peeked over the hood, catching a fleeting glimpse of the transport as it sped past. Its design was sleek, military-grade, unmarked, save for a faint emblem near the tail, barely visible in the dim light. The Galactic elite. They're enforcers. The hand that kept order where words failed. Leah's pulse quickened. Confirmed visual. Passenger spotted. Her mind calculated the possibilities. They couldn't let this one slip away. Too many had already disappeared before they could get answers. And the answers mattered. Because despite everything, the assassinations, the vanishing operatives, the growing silence, no one knew why. Interception point 3 blocks ahead. Kieran's voice cut through her thoughts. "Move." She obeyed, navigating the city's skeleton with practiced ease. The streets were a map she had memorized through necessity, each alley a potential escape route, each ruined building a makeshift hideout. The craft was nearing the boulevard. Leah positioned herself at the intersection, heart pounding against her ribs. She had one shot. Then the world exploded. A blinding flash tore through the night, followed by a concussive wave that sent her sprawling. The ground shook, debris raining down like shards of broken glass. Ears ringing, she rolled to her side, breath coming in sharp gasps as she tried to reorient herself. Smoke billowed from the wreckage of the transport, its sleek frame now twisted and burning. "Kieran," she hissed, fingers scrambling for her earpiece. Silence. Dread coiled in her stomach, but she forced it down. Later. There would be time for panic later. Now there was only the mission. She staggered to her feet, sprinting towards the wreckage as the heat from the flames licked at her skin. If the target was alive, they wouldn't stay that way for long. A figure stumbled from the wreck, coughing, disoriented. Leah's breath caught. Not the pilot. The passenger. Her weapon was up before she had even registered drawing it. "Don't move." The figure froze, hands slowly rising. The fire cast flickering shadows over them, and then she saw it, the face. Her heart nearly stopped. No. It wasn't possible. The Galactic elite didn't send low-ranking officers on missions like this. And this wasn't just any officer. Leah knew this face. The world knew this face. Because it had been broadcast across every surviving network. Declared dead. One of the first to fall. One of the very leaders they had lost. Her grip on the weapon tightened. Her mind raced. How? Why? This changed everything. If he was alive, then what had they been fighting for? What had they been mourning? The man's breath was ragged, his eyes filled with something she couldn't quite name. Fear, yes, but something deeper. Desperation. "You don't understand," he rasped, voice raw. "Everything you know is a lie." The flames crackled around them, the city holding its breath once more. And in that moment, Leah understood. The assassinations had never been about control. They had been about deception. And the real war had only just begun. The flames crackled behind her, their heat licking at Leah's back as she kept her weapon trained on the man before her. His breath came in ragged gasps, his face pale beneath a sheen of sweat. The smoke swirled between them, a veil of shifting shadows that distorted the moment, making it feel unreal. But the weight of the gun in her hands, the tension in her jaw, those were real. The man standing before her, the one who was supposed to be dead, was real. She swallowed hard. "You have 10 seconds to explain why I shouldn't put a bullet in you." The man held her gaze, something unreadable flickering behind his dark eyes. He didn't look afraid. No, fear would have been too easy to decipher. What she saw instead was worse. A quiet understanding, as if he had known this moment would come. As if he had been waiting for it. "You won't," he said, voice raw but certain. Leah's finger tensed against the trigger. "Try me." The man's gaze flicked toward the wreckage behind her, where the last embers of the explosion still smoldered. "If you wanted me dead, you wouldn't have rushed to pull me out of that fire." She clenched her jaw. He was right, but she wasn't about to admit it. The truth was, instinct had propelled her forward when she saw him stumble from the wreck. Instinct and something deeper, something that sent a cold ripple down her spine. Because if he was alive, then everything they had been told was a lie. Before she could press him further, a new sound cut through the air, a sharp static burst from her earpiece. "Kieran." She pressed her fingers to the device. "Talk to me." Silence. Then, a faint breath, labored and uneven. "Status," she demanded. "Alive," came the reply, tight with pain. "Ran into some company. Took a hit." Leah exhaled sharply. "Location." A pause. "Then, west of your position. 2 blocks. Don't linger." She lowered her gun but didn't holster it. The man, no, the ghost, watched her closely, his posture eerily relaxed given the circumstances. She hated that. Hated the calm way he looked at her, as if he knew something she didn't. "We're leaving," she said. "And you're coming with me." He gave a slow nod, but there was no submission in the gesture. Just acceptance. They moved through the alley swiftly, the ruined city around them breathing in slow, dying gasps. The remnants of streetlights flickered, their glow casting eerie, fractured shapes against the cracked pavement. Shadows stretched unnaturally long, shifting with each step they took. Leah kept her pace brisk, glancing back only once to ensure the man was still following. He was silent, steady, a ghost walking through the ruins of a world that had left him behind. When they found Kieran, he was leaning against the remnants of a collapsed overpass, one hand pressed against a bleeding wound at his side. His face was drawn, but his eyes remained sharp, scanning the darkness around them. Leah crouched beside him, assessing the damage. How bad? He gave her a dry smirk. Nothing fatal. Just inconvenient. She pulled a field dressing from her belt, working quickly to staunch the bleeding. Kieran didn't flinch. She had seen him take worse. His gaze flicked past her, landing on the man standing a few feet away. The smirk vanished. His entire body tensed, but not in the way she expected. Not with shock. Not even with suspicion. But with recognition. Leah felt the shift immediately. Her hand stilled against the bandage, and she turned sharply toward Kieran. You know him. Kieran's jaw tightened. He didn't answer right away, but that was answer enough. She turned back to the man, the one they had spent months believing was dead, the one whose assassination had unraveled the world. The one who now stood before them with the calm of someone who had never truly left the game. What the hell is going on? She demanded. The man met her gaze, his expression unreadable. The war you think you've been fighting, he said quietly. It's not the real war. Leah's pulse quickened. Then what is? The man inhaled, as if steadying himself. Then, in a voice edged with something dangerously close to regret, he said, the one that started before any of you knew you were in it. The city loomed around them, silent as ever, but suddenly, it felt different. No longer just a battlefield. No longer just a ruin, but a graveyard. And Leah had the sinking feeling they were standing on the wrong side of it. The night pressed in around them, thick with smoke and the distant echoes of sirens. Leah's grip on her weapon tightened, her muscles locked in tension as she tried to make sense of the man before her. Elias Vane. The ghost of a war that should have ended with his execution. The man whose death had shattered the fragile balance of power and plunged Earth into chaos. Yet here he stood, breathing, watching her with a calm that set her teeth on edge. She wasn't the only one struggling to process it. Kieran, still pressed against the ruins of the overpass, was looking at Vane with an expression Leah had never seen before. Not shock, not suspicion. Recognition. And that was what made her stomach twist. Her voice was razor-sharp when she spoke. You knew. Kieran exhaled through his nose, slow and measured. Not like this. Not like this. Leah repeated, her voice rising. He's supposed to be dead, Kieran. His execution was broadcast across every surviving network. We watched it happen. At this, Vane tilted his head slightly, that maddeningly calm expression never faltering. You saw what they wanted you to see. The simplicity of the statement sent a ripple of unease through her. She had spent months unraveling the aftermath of the assassinations, digging through broken intelligence networks, following dead leads, watching as the world fell apart. And now, the man who had started it all stood before her, claiming the entire thing had been a fabrication. Her hand tightened on her weapon, but she didn't fire. Not yet. Start talking. Vane studied her, then exhaled, as if accepting an inevitability. I am Elias Vane, he said, and I did die that day. Kieran swore under his breath and turned away, dragging a hand down his face. Leah ignored him, her focus locked on Vane. That's impossible, she said. But even as the words left her mouth, doubt crept in at the edges. Vane's expression didn't waver. You think I wanted to disappear? That I wanted the world to burn in my absence? Leah shook her head, clearing the static building in her thoughts. None of this makes sense. Vane's gaze hardened. It does if you understand the real war. The one that started long before the first leader was killed. For the first time, Kieran spoke, his voice quiet but sure. The assassinations weren't about control, he said. They were about erasure. Vane nodded once. They weren't just eliminating leaders. They were eliminating memories. Rewriting history as they went. A chill slithered down Leah's spine. That's not possible. People remember. Do they? Vane cut in. Or do they remember what they've been told to remember? The question sent ice through her veins. The footage had been clear. The reports had been airtight. Too airtight. She had trusted what she saw, what she read, because the alternative was too unthinkable. But what if that was the point? What if the truth had never been allowed to reach her at all? She took a step closer, lowering her gun slightly but keeping her stance rigid. If that's true, why keep you alive? Vane exhaled, raking a hand through his disheveled hair. Because I was more useful in the dark than I ever was in the light. Kieran's jaw tightened. They used you. They tried. Vane's voice was sharp. But now? Now I'm done playing along. Leah had spent years learning not to trust easily. Trust was a liability. Trust got people killed. But standing here, staring at the supposed corpse of a man whose death had rewritten history, she felt something far more dangerous creeping in. Oh! The distant wail of sirens cut through the heavy silence, a reminder that they were running out of time. Leah holstered her weapon and turned to Kieran. Can you move? He smirked weakly. Not gracefully, but I'll manage. She turned back to Vane. If you're serious about ending this, then you better have a plan. Vane's lips curved into a knowing, almost weary smile. I have something better. Leah arched a brow. And what's that? He met her gaze, his voice unwavering. Proof. And for the first time in months, Leah felt something shift. Not just in the war, but in herself. The game had changed. And this time, she intended to win. The streets were a maze of ruin and silence, the remnants of a city that had learned to live in fear. Leah moved quickly, her boots light against the cracked pavement, her pulse steady despite the chaos still burning in her mind. Elias Vane, dead but not dead, erased but standing beside her, kept pace without effort. His presence unsettled her more than she cared to admit. Kieran, still favoring his injured side, trudged along behind them, his breathing controlled but measured. He hadn't said much since Vane dropped his revelation, but Leah knew the wheels in his head were turning just as fast as hers. They had all seen the execution, the brutal finality of it. But if that had been a lie, then what else had been rewritten? Vane had promised proof. Leah intended to hold him to that. The safe house was a decayed structure tucked beneath the bones of an overpass, long abandoned but still standing. They entered through a rusted service hatch, weaving through the remnants of a past life, broken furniture, forgotten machines, layers of dust thick enough to smother memories. Inside, the air was damp, carrying the scent of metal and old insulation. The dim lighting flickered, powered by an old battery cell humming softly in the corner. Leah bolted the door behind them and turned sharply toward Vane. Start talking. Vane leaned against the nearest wall, arms crossed, expression unreadable. How much do you think you know about the war? Leah narrowed her eyes. Enough to know we're losing it. He smirked faintly. You're not losing. You already lost. You just haven't realized it yet. Kieran, who had sunk onto a battered bench, let out a short laugh, though there was no humor in it. Great. Love an optimist. Leah ignored him, her patience thinning. Cut the theatrics, Vane. You have something we need, or we wouldn't be standing here. So whatever proof you've been sitting on, now's the time to share. Vane studied her for a long moment, then reached into the inner pocket of his jacket. Leah stiffened, but he moved slowly, deliberately, before producing a small, rectangular drive no larger than his palm. He held it between two fingers. This, he said, his tone measured, is the only unaltered archive left. Leah stepped forward cautiously, eyes flicking between him and the drive. Archive of what? The real history. The war before the war. He tossed it toward her, and she caught it effortlessly. The casing was smooth, warm from the heat of his body. It looked unremarkable. Kieran peered at it from where he sat. And what exactly makes that different from every other classified file we've risked our lives for? Vane's smirk faded. Because it's not classified. It's erased. And the difference between the two is everything. Leah turned the device over in her palm. If he was right, if this drive contained the truth, then someone had gone to great lengths to ensure no one ever saw it. Where did you get this? She asked. Vane exhaled through his nose, his fingers briefly flexing at his sides, the first sign of unease she'd seen in him. I was there when they destroyed the originals. All of them. Every record, every broadcast, every historical account that didn't fit the new narrative. His gaze darkened. And they kept me alive because they needed someone to verify the forgeries. Someone who knew the truth well enough to twist it into something else. Leah's stomach twisted. And you did it? Vane met her stare, unwavering. I made them believe I did. Kieran let out a slow breath, running a hand over his jaw. And then what? You just walked out the front door. Vane's mouth twitched in something that wasn't quite amusement. Not exactly. Let's just say they got careless. Leah's grip tightened on the drive. So what's on here that was worth killing an entire planet's memory? Vane nodded toward the corner of the room, where a terminal sat half buried beneath discarded supplies. Find out for yourself. Leah hesitated. If he was lying, if this was a trap, they were already dead. But if he was telling the truth? She crossed the room, powered on the terminal, and slotted the drive into the port. The machine whirred softly. Then the screen flickered to life, lines of encrypted data streaming across the interface before resolving into something clearer. A map. It wasn't a map of Earth. It wasn't even a map of the known systems. It was older. Far older than anything she had ever seen. It marked territories and alliances that no longer existed, names that had been erased from history. And at the center of it all, connected by a web of vanished civilizations, was Earth. A cold shiver ran through her. This wasn't a war about resources, or politics, or even power. It was about something deeper. Something buried. Something someone didn't want them to find. Vane's voice was quiet when he spoke. Now do you see? Leah tore her gaze from the screen and looked at him, truly looked at him. And for the first time she understood. This war had never been about survival. It had been about keeping the past dead. And now, they had just resurrected it. The dim glow of the terminal cast long shadows across the abandoned safehouse. Leah's fingers hovered over the screen, the flickering map before her rewriting everything she thought she knew. She had spent her life believing Earth was nothing more than an afterthought in the grand design of the universe, a primitive world lucky to have clawed its way into the stars. But this changed everything. Her pulse hammered as she traced the lines connecting Earth to the long-erased civilizations. Names she had never seen before, symbols she didn't recognize. But they were there, undeniable, burned into the archives beneath centuries of deliberate destruction. Kieran, sitting stiffly against the wall, let out a slow breath. I don't buy it. His voice was measured, but Leah could hear the tension beneath it. There's no way Earth was ever at the center of anything. If we were so important, why hasn't there been so much as a whisper about it? Because that's the point, Vane said, stepping forward. He gestured toward the screen. They didn't just erase our history. They erased the memory of it. You think this war started with the assassinations? It started long before that. Before we were even capable of realizing we were fighting it. Leah clenched her jaw, still struggling to process it. Who's they? Vane's gaze darkened. The architects of silence. He pointed to the map, his finger stopping at a blank space near the outer edge of known space. The ones who decided what should and shouldn't exist. Leah exhaled sharply. And you're telling me they decided we shouldn't exist? Vane nodded. Not in the way we once did. Her grip tightened on the table's edge. The idea that history could be rewritten, that an entire planet could be stripped of its past, should have been impossible. But hadn't she already seen the effects firsthand? The stagnation, the unexplained gaps in progress, the lack of record stretching back beyond a few millennia. What if it had never been Earth's failure? What if it had been designed that way? Kieran, frowning, leaned forward slightly. Say you're right. Say they erased us, buried us so deep that even our own people don't remember what we were. Why? What did we do to make them so afraid? Vane hesitated. His fingers flexed at his sides, a rare break in composure. I don't have the full picture. But I have pieces. Leah turned to him sharply. Then give us what you do have. Vane exhaled through his nose, nodding toward the terminal. That archive? It wasn't just hidden, it was buried. I found it in an underground vault beneath what used to be the unified colony's capital. It was one of the last places left untouched after the purges. Kieran's brow furrowed. Purges. Vane's jaw tightened. When the assassinations started, they weren't just eliminating leadership. They were wiping out entire knowledge bases, databanks, libraries, anything that could contradict the new reality they were building. It wasn't just a political coup. It was the restructuring of existence itself. A chill ran through Leah's spine. "And you were there?" "I was their proofreader," he said bitterly. "They needed someone who knew the truth well enough to reshape it into something else." He gestured at the screen. "But they made a mistake. They thought destruction was enough. That once something was erased, it couldn't be remembered." He looked at Leah, his gaze sharp. "They didn't account for human nature." She frowned. "What do you mean?" "The message," he said. "Play it again." Leah hesitated but obeyed. The static-filled transmission crackled to life once more, the voice cutting through the heavy silence. "They think we're broken. They think we're beaten. But they've underestimated the one thing that sets us apart. We never forget." The recording ended. Kieran let out a slow exhale. Who was that? Vane's expression was unreadable. Her name was Commander Rhea Solis. She was one of the last resistance leaders before the final purge. And she was executed 200 years ago. Leah stiffened. "That's not possible." Vane held her gaze. "Not if time has been rewritten." The thought made her stomach turn. She glanced at the map again, at the empty spaces where civilizations should have been. If they've been controlling history for that long, how do we even begin to fight back? Vane tilted his head. "We start by proving it exists." He gestured toward the drive still slotted into the terminal. "That archive? It's the only unaltered record left. If we can get it out, make it known, the entire structure of their control collapses." Leah's fingers hovered over the screen. The weight of what he was saying pressed down on her. If this was real, if this archive contained the truth, then the second it was released, everything changed. For better or worse. She turned to Kieran. "We can't do this alone." Kieran nodded, rubbing a hand over his face. "Yeah, but we also can't trust just anyone." Leah exhaled. "Then we start small. We find people we know, people who aren't compromised." She turned to Vane. "You said they tried to rewrite the truth, but people still remember fragments. That means there are others out there who know something is wrong." Vane gave a slow nod. "There are. But reaching them without alerting the wrong people will be nearly impossible." Kieran scoffed. "Impossible's a strong word. You clearly pulled off your own resurrection just fine." Vane smirked slightly. "Fair point." The terminal let out a sudden, sharp beep. Leah's breath caught as the screen flickered. A small red indicator pulsed in the corner. A warning. Kieran's entire body went rigid. "Tell me that's not." The warning klaxon blared. Leah's blood ran cold. Vane's jaw clenched. "They found us." Leah's hands were already moving, yanking the drive from the terminal. The second it disconnected, the screen scrambled, the data dissolving into a meaningless cascade of numbers. Kieran pushed himself to his feet with a grimace. "How bad?" Vane pulled a small device from his jacket, checking the readings. His expression darkened. "Bad." The walls seemed to close in around them. The safe house had always been a temporary shelter, never meant to withstand a full-scale assault. Leah could already hear the distant thrum of approaching engines, the steady rhythm of an organized response force. They weren't going to get a second chance. Leah turned to the others. "We move. Now." No one argued. As they slipped out into the night, the weight of history pressed against Leah's chest. They weren't just running for survival anymore. They were running to bring back a world that had been stolen. The night was alive with pursuit. Engines roared in the distance, the rhythmic pulse of approaching warships shaking the air. The safe house was compromised, its thin walls offering no protection against the forces hunting them. Leah moved first, pushing through the narrow alley, Kieran close behind. Vane followed, his steps unervingly quiet for a man carrying the weight of an entire forgotten history. The stolen archive drive pressed against Leah's palm, still warm from the terminal. It was nothing more than a sliver of metal and data, but it held the power to shatter an empire built on silence. If they could get it out, if they could live long enough to share it. The alley opened onto a wide industrial street, littered with the remains of a civilization that had stopped fighting long ago. The lights above flickered, some shattered, some barely holding on. The city loomed around them, empty but never truly abandoned. There were always eyes. Always ears. Kieran swore under his breath. We're boxed in. They'll have drones on every street by now. Vane scanned the skyline, gaze sharp. There's a way out. Leah didn't ask how he knew, just followed when he moved. The path twisted through crumbling infrastructure, past collapsed tunnels and rusted transport rails. They moved fast, but the hum of pursuit grew closer. A low thud reverberated through the air. The ground trembled beneath their feet. They're locking down the district, Kieran muttered. They'll herd us straight into their hands. Leah's jaw tightened. She'd spent years outmaneuvering enemies, but this wasn't the usual chase. They weren't running from soldiers. They were running from history itself. Vane slowed as they neared an abandoned transit hub, its entrance choked with debris. He placed a hand against the wall, searching, then pressed something, a hidden panel, nearly invisible beneath layers of dust. A door hissed open. Kieran stared. Convenient. Vane offered a smirk. Not really. He stepped inside. Leah hesitated only a second before following. The door sealed behind them, swallowing the noise of the city. The corridor beyond was dark, lined with old tech, machines left to rot, terminals flickering weakly with residual power. What is this place? Leah asked. A remnant, Vane said. One of the last. The deeper they moved, the clearer it became. This wasn't just an escape route. It was a graveyard of forgotten knowledge. Rusted consoles, shattered datapads, documents so old they crumbled at the edges. The air itself felt heavy with the ghosts of a world that had once existed and had been erased with terrifying precision. Leah's fingers skimmed over the surface of a dead monitor, dust collecting on her fingertips. This was a resistance hub. Vane nodded. The last one. Before they wiped them out. Kieran exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. And let me guess. They don't know this place still exists. Vane's expression darkened. They do now. The warning klaxons above blared again. Louder, sharper. The air grew thick with static. Something was coming. Leah turned to Vane. Tell me we have another exit. He didn't answer. Instead, he strode to the farthest console, kneeling beside it. With careful hands, he pried open the casing, revealing a hidden compartment inside. He pulled out a small, sleek device, older than anything Leah had seen, its design unfamiliar. This, he said, standing. This is how we end it. Kieran eyed the device warily. You're going to have to be more specific. Vane turned it in his hands. It's a failsafe. A record, embedded so deeply into the system that they never found it. If we activate it, every erased file, every deleted truth, gets broadcasted back into the network. Leah stared. You had this the whole time? No, his grip tightened around the device. I knew it existed, but I didn't know where. Until now. Kieran let out a breath. So we turn it on. Vane met his gaze. It's not that simple. The ground trembled. They were out of time. Leah stepped forward. What's the risk? Vane hesitated. It's not just a broadcast. It's a restoration. The moment it activates, everything they erased resurfaces. Leah frowned. That's the goal. Vane's voice was quiet. No. You don't understand. He lifted the device. This doesn't just send information. It rebuilds it. Restores it completely. His gaze locked onto hers. Including the war. The room fell silent. Kieran was the first to speak. You're saying if we do this, we don't just remember the past. His voice was grim. We bring it back. Vane nodded. In full. Leah's breath caught. She had thought they were fighting to reclaim history, to expose the truth. But if Vane was right, if this device did what he claimed, then they weren't just revealing a hidden war. They were waking it up. Kieran let out a harsh laugh, running a hand through his hair. So we either let them keep controlling history, or we risk plunging the galaxy back into a war we don't understand. Vane's expression was unreadable. That war never ended. They just made you forget it. Leah's grip tightened. She had spent her life fighting battles she didn't understand, chasing ghosts of conflicts she never had the full picture of. But now she had a choice. One that could change everything. The sound of boots echoed through the corridors above. They had minutes. Kieran looked at Leah. Tell me we're not actually considering this. She met his gaze. There was no easy answer. No clean victory. But she knew one thing. She was done letting someone else decide what the truth was. She turned to Vane. Do it. He nodded once, then activated the device. A pulse of light radiated outward, the air itself seeming to bend around them. The old machines flared to life. The walls hummed. And outside, the sky changed. Leah staggered back as the very city shifted, flickering, reshaping. The skyline was no longer broken. It was whole, as if time itself was unraveling. Memories flooded back, not just into the network, but into the world itself. People remembered. And across the stars, the ones who had rewritten history realized they had just lost control. The ground shook with the force of something enormous awakening. Leah's breath hitched. They had done it. And now, they had to survive what came next.